Today I want to talk to you a little bit about swatching. Swatching is one of those things that, even for experienced knitters, can often fill them with a sense of dread. And in fact, I know a lot of people who will take great pride in saying that they never swatch. But it's not really a huge advantage to not swatch, because you have no information to work on if you don't swatch. And in fact, it's a really, really good learning tool and can be a very enjoyable part of the whole knitting process. So to begin with, if you've heard the word swatch, you might go, what on earth is a swatch? Particularly so if you're in the UK, because it's usually known as a tension square. So if you take a look at the cardigan I'm wearing, for instance, or sweaters that are up behind me, if you want to go from a skein of yarn and needles to that finished piece, the only way to know that you have the correct finished size is by swatching, because every single one of those stitches are like little building blocks. They're a certain number of inches, centimeters wide, and a certain number deep. And depending on your needle size and the fabric, the fabric or the material that your needles are made of, they're going to be a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. If you just go into a blind, what that will mean is that you have no way of controlling the size of your finished piece. Now, there may be certain things that you work with where that doesn't really matter, but it can still have a little bit of an impact if you're running or you're operating with a very small amount of yarn, for instance, because you actually are going to use more or less yarn also depending on the size of your gauge. So if you go ahead, you don't check your gauge and you think it doesn't matter what size this ends up, it's have no impact to me. It's a shawl, it's a scarf, whatever it might be. But it might actually mean that you run out of yarn too quickly, because to get to the same finished size, you have to do more knitting because your stitches are smaller, for instance. So it can have it can have other knock-on implications as well. Second reason that is often overlooked that I find really helpful is the fact that it allows you to practice the stitch. Particularly for complex stitches and things like that, having gone through a few inches and try to figure out how it works, where you're likely to run into problems, it means that when you then translate that into a much bigger piece, whether it's a garment or a hat or a shawl, you know that stitch, so you can focus on the rest of the pattern. So it's a little bit like breaking down skills into smaller steps because you've practiced it already. So there's lots of more reasons than just figuring out the gauge, while that is extremely important. So that's why you should swatch. The next one we can take a look at is, because often there's kind of questions that regularly come in or you see popping up over and over again, and the next one I'd see very often is, how do I swatch? What do I actually do to swatch? So when you swatch, you'll see on a pattern, it'll give you the gauge per 4 inches or per 10 centimeters. You don't want to knit a square that's exactly a 4 by 4 inch, because that is not going to give you enough to work with. The edges of your knitting are typically going to be a little bit looser, so you want to move in a little from the edge. I usually aim for about 6 inches by 6 inches so I can avoid the sides. Then when you're actually measuring it, measure it in a few different places, because sometimes there might be a loose stitch, tight stitch, so there's going to be a little bit of variation. Once you've got the swatch knit, then you want to go and block it, and that means basically blocking it in whatever way that you would block your final knit. So if you wet block, which is primarily what I do, what you want to actually do then is wet block it, lay it out smoothly, flatten the stitches. If it's going to be something like a shawl where it's stretched, then pin it out and stretch it and let it dry. If it's pinned, unpin it, shake it out, and I'll usually wait for a day or two to let the gauge settle. In case it had been pulled out, distorted a little, it can spring back a small bit, and then you'll measure it. So I'm going to step through in a second here and I'll show you how to measure the gauge, and I'll follow up on another common question, which is how you can go and do a swatch in the round.